Novoty. First of all, I'd like to point out that tobacco is one of the highest, one of the largest risk factors for almost everything that we know. And certainly among the preventable risk factors, probably the most important. So the struggle against the use of tobacco has been a constant in public health. And also the resistance of the tobacco industry against the measures that have been taken is also something that has epical proportions. And Professor Novoty, in many different capabilities, either in the government or in academia, has been at the forefront of this fight, and certainly has a lot of information about that as an actor and also as a witness of many of the things that happened in the last 30 years. So without further ado, we're very honored to have you here, and I'd like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much. This one is working. Yes? Sit down. This is a small group we can make at a seminar. And if you want to interrupt me anytime, it's okay. And I'm very thankful to Ken Camargo and the rest of the faculty here to come and speak about my favorite subject, which is tobacco. But an interesting angle on this, which is the environment. And most people know that tobacco is the worst public health problem in the world, but that I think less is known about this environmental connection. And so today I want to review that and let you know. I sent an article to Dr. Camargo, Professor Camargo, that we're just publishing a week ago in the World Health Bulletin, WHO Bulletin, and it summarizes everything I'm going to say. So it's a nice little addition to the literature. It's not a lot of science because not so much research has been done on some of these issues, but I think when we talk about some of these environmental connections, you'll understand how this actually can act as a form of tobacco control to address this environmental issue. Why? Well, the environmental advocacy groups and environmental activists are great allies, and if they realize the environmental impacts of tobacco, they will help this whole battle, which is, we hope, reaching what's called the end point. And many people are talking about this end point of tobacco. But look around you, and I don't think that most of us would believe that the end point is anywhere near. It's many, many years away. But this is a piece that might add to that progress. So I'm going to talk about this. I think, as Dr. Camargo mentioned, it's a huge public health problem, and it's about 10% of mortality globally. In the U.S., it's about 20%, and here in Brazil also 20% of preventable mortality. Now, that doesn't mean every single death has a tobacco cause. It's the proportional impact that is the attributable fraction. If you think of death as a pie, that part of the pie is 20% related to tobacco, attributable tobacco, but globally it's about 10%. There's millions of people that die each year, 6 million per year now roughly, and that's going to increase because even if everybody quit today, there would still be residual impacts of tobacco with cancers, cardiovascular disease, etc. The thing that I think is hard to conceptualize is the number of cigarettes that are smoked every year. 6 trillion, more than 6 trillion. If you think about that, it's just an enormous business, first of all, but also an enormous impact on the environment. Where do those cigarettes go? We'll talk about that later. But here's the graph of the growth in per capita, or rather total cigarette consumption, of production and consumption. And this doesn't include, BDs and sort of hand-rolled. This is manufactured cigarettes that are done by mostly multinational tobacco companies, many of which are consolidating into large multinational conglomerates. And so this has gone up. So we haven't reached the end. We haven't even come close, because as the prevalence goes down, yes, the percent of people here in Brazil, it's about the same as it is in the U.S. We're down to about, I think, 17% right now of adults. But the population has gone up, and especially in areas where tobacco prevalence is not really going down any. So the number of cigarettes smoked by the world is going up. Now, most of you probably have heard of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is the world's first health treaty. And this was started, actually, I was trying to lead the U.S. delegation on this back in 1999, in 2000, until George Bush was elected, and then it was almost impossible to do anything, and that was a good time for me to move into academia. Anyway, it was a treaty, which is a binding obligation. That means that when countries sign this treaty, they have to accommodate their national legislation to accept the principles of the treaty. And there's many, many parts of this treaty. Not all of them are really implemented very well. One of them has to do with the environment. Well, actually 2 or 3 of them have to do with the environment. But the Article 18 of the Framework Convention Treaty is about the environment, to protect the environment and the health of persons related to tobacco agriculture, manufacture, and also waste disposal, which is interesting. So it's named in the treaty as a potential avenue for tobacco control or responsibility by governments who sign and ratify the treaty. The U.S., by the way, has signed it, but has not ratified it. So it's not law in the U.S., even though we have lots and lots of tobacco control stuff going on. Brazil is one of the key players of this activity. Pedro Luiz da Costa e Silva is the head of the secretariat that manages the conference of the parties. Tanya Kapakachi is actually heading up a working group on the environment, and I'm going to meet with her later today to talk about this. So we have a project with WHO, my NGO. I have an NGO called the Cigarette Butt Pollution Project. And we are talking about lots of different environmental issues. Well, here's a little graphic that illustrates the number of cigarettes that if you had these 6 trillion cigarettes lined up one after another, would go to the moon and back many, 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 many times. It's hard to imagine that, the number and the quantity of this stuff, all of which gets dumped into the environment somehow. Anyway. But it's actually more than just the cigarette butts that I'm going to talk about, and it's a whole life cycle of environmental impacts that we can think about. And it starts with tobacco growing, which is an agricultural process that's very hard on the soil, very hard on the farmers who grow it, and has all sorts of ramifications, all sorts of complications due to deforestation, which I'll mention, and the whole production process. And then there is, of course, tobacco production, which is a highly mechanized, but also a dirty industry, and I'll tell you about that. And then it moves into even transportation, which is part of the production process, cigarette consumption, and there are environmental aspects of that, including secondhand smoke, which is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the world. The first leading cause is smoking, and the second leading cause is secondhand smoke. And third-hand smoke. Has anybody heard this term, third-hand smoke? Yeah. Okay, well, something new for you to absorb. Well, please don't absorb it, I'll tell you about that. And then the last one is my little project on cigarette butts. So this is what we're going to just review briefly. Is this plausible? When we talk about causal relationships, we talk about dose response and consistency and other kinds of characteristics of evidence. One of those is whether it's biologically plausible that something causes a problem. So if you think, today we're going to think about, is there a biologic plausibility that tobacco growing, manufacture, transport, smoking, and disposal have an impact on the environment? And so I think we can all understand a lot of possibilities that is even with global warming. And I want to spend a little time on that too. Water pollution for sure. We've worked out some interesting research on this. Deforestation, there's been a considerable amount of research on this. Not so much here in Brazil. I actually contacted one of your climate change experts recently, Dr. I can't remember his name. But he says, well, the tobacco growing areas have not been sort of deforested as in the Amazon, but they still have an agricultural impact. So this is biologically plausible. So does this industry harm the environment? Is this a harmful industry? Does it have an impact on greenhouse, global warming? Well, we'll see. Does it contribute then to global warming and loss of forest, deforestation, etc., changes in chemical exposure in the environment? We'll see. It has potential impacts on the ocean and coastal areas, perhaps as a result of some of the waste that we're going to be talking about. So it's very possible that the tobacco industry has impacts on this, except for overpopulation. Well, except maybe because they reduce the population through their product use. We'll see. Well, anyway, the one point that I want to make to you is that we have access now to a secret or formerly secret internal tobacco industry documents that tells us a lot about the thinking of these criminals who sell tobacco. And in fact, these documents have been used to convict them of organized crime violations, meaning like racketeering and mafia-like stuff, which is they've lied to the public about nicotine addiction. They've lied to the public about the benefit of low tar, low nicotine cigarettes. They're a terrible bunch of people. And one of the things that they did, which I didn't realize this till I started looking at these documents, is they helped to deny the impacts of anthropogenic effects on global warming and greenhouse gases. Why? Because their whole premise of resistance to tobacco control is to increase the doubt about the science, to call the science that's done junk science, to say that, look, tobacco has no impact on secondhand smoke in the environment. So what they were doing was actually funding some of the organizations, that were denying global warming and human impact on global warming. So even from their own rationale was shared by the people who deny the scientific evidence for global warming. Anyway, so these quotes kind of illustrate that our objective is to discredit the Environmental Protection Agency and to prevent states and businesses from smoking bans. I mean, this is what they're really after. Their product is doubt, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public, that is scientific evidence. Anyway, it's a very interesting history of this. So yeah, we talked a little bit about pesticides, and there's heavy use of pesticides in the growing of tobacco, and some of them actually by themselves contribute to ozone depletion, that's methyl bromide. Well, anyway, they accumulate toxic chemicals and they degrade the soil as the tobacco is grown, and it's very hard on soil actually, so it takes a lot of chemicals to grow it. There's also something called green tobacco illness. Farmers who grow tobacco and people who handle the product as it's being processed get exposed to the nicotine, which is nicotine itself is a pesticide, interestingly. And it's this addictive drug that has all sorts of neurochemical implications for the developing brain, but it is also an environmental exposure. So green tobacco illness is something that farmers who don't use occupational protection against this exposure can get, and it has neurological complications. It can have all sorts of impact on children especially. We know that nicotine affects the young developing brain, and so many farmers in developing countries are children, women, etc. that are part of a family farming environment. So this has some implications for development as well. Deforestation, these estimates are hard to come by, but there's a guy named Helmut Geist who has been for the last 20 years studying hard the quantity of deforestation that's attributable to cigarette smoking. So he's going to be working with us on this project, but he's estimated in the past that 200,000 hectares of land has been deforested in support of agriculture, but also curing. You may know that tobacco can be air cured, that is dried out in the air, or put into these barns that a low temperature wood fire is ignited to cure them. In the US, a lot of our barns are now heated by natural gas, but most of the world it's wood cured tobacco. So the wood burned to cure the tobacco is also part of the deforestation problem. And that's probably more significant, actually, than agriculture. So anyway, those can, of course, deforestation affects ecosystems and has that impact. Right now, it's about 12% of deforestation might have been caused by carrion. It's hard to get these data, but for some countries, it's much worse than others. Tanzania, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, African countries are primarily affected by the deforestation problem. The other thing that happens is when countries depend on tobacco as a cash crop, they stop growing food as much. Malawi right now is nearly totally dependent on tobacco exports for the cash that is then used to buy food, where the farmers have stopped growing subsistence farming for food. So this, hasn't been quantified. This needs to be looked at more carefully. But when you have a closed system where the tobacco industry, the buyers of the leaf, provide the seeds, the pesticides, the equipment, and the loans to the farmers to grow the tobacco, and then the farmers are indebted to those industries to then sell their crops at controlled prices. The market is not fair for these poor farmers. So there are additional issues related to diverting themselves from subsistence so that the farm market actually keeps the prices low because it's controlled by the industry. There's several buying collectives and as well as the tobacco manufacturing tobacco producers that have an impact on this. So it's not a fair system. And then we talk about cigarette production and waste accumulation. These industries are dirty. And we've actually, the U.S. is, many of their tobacco production facilities have moved overseas where there are fewer regulatory activities over the manufacturing process. And there's something called a toxic release inventory that our environmental agency has published, where it lists the chemicals that are produced in manufacturing and whether they should be carefully disposed of or regulated. And there's about 42 of these chemicals that are produced in tobacco production, and so they're very, toxic substances as well. So the manufacturing is a dirty process as well. And there's all sorts of other stuff in the packaging. So they produce airborne waste, solid waste, etc. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the quantities are quite significant. And there have been now attempts to map out this stuff across the world. Transport of the product is something that also contributes to ozone depletion and greenhouse gases because of the combustion of the delivery devices, delivery services, etc. So all of these things are there. And then smoking itself, you might think, well, people are blowing smoke into the air, and yeah, it produces carbon dioxide, methane, and these are also greenhouse gases that might contribute to climate change as well. That's not been quantified very thoroughly. Secondhand smoke, as I mentioned, is a carcinogenic exposure. There's 4,000 chemicals in cigarette smoke, and many of them are carcinogens. And as I mentioned, it's the second leading cause of lung cancer. So many carcinogens in secondhand smoke and the exposure from that is an environmental contaminant. This is what we have depended on, the science behind this to regulate clean indoor air legislation. When you go to a restaurant, most of, in here in Rio too, you're not exposed to smoke anymore. It used to be terrible, I know, in the U.S. too. But practically every state in the U.S. now bans smoking in all restaurants. Most ban it in bars too. There's a few places that don't. But that's not for the clients. That's not for the customers. That was a work site issue for the people who serve food and work in the bars. That was a work site protection issue that allowed smoking to be banned in these places and benefit the people who go into them only occasionally. So that was an interesting part of history as well. So then there's this third-hand smoke thing. It's pretty easy. When I got into a cab yesterday here, and the lady was a smoker. You can smell the leftover smoke on a person, but if they smoke in a car or in a house, there's a coating of a material. And here, this is a picture of where pictures were on the wall in a house of a smoker. And you can see the exposure on just the staining of the walls. A house or a car that has had a smoker in it, it is decreased in value by about 15%. So, renting or buying a house with a smoker, it is very difficult to eliminate this stuff. It doesn't just, wash away. So secondhand or third-hand smoke has been shown to have DNA effects, the exposure to it. You can do wipes of the surfaces and take it to the lab and identify all sorts of toxic exposures in it. So third-hand smoke is another area where the environment has some regulatory opportunities. Fires, smoking is, there's a long list of stuff here, but fires are still 8 to 10% of them in developed countries at least are caused by smoking in homes or businesses. And the chief single cause of fire-related deaths in the US and the UK is smoking caused fires. So they have a mortality impact. It's in the few thousands, but it's done. It's there. Property damage, you can imagine that, and also forest fires and wildfires from smoking. So then, after we've got production understood a bit more, this last part that I wanted to emphasize is what I've been doing a lot of research on with some other colleagues, and this is the butts and the gimbas. I'm reminded of what the right word was. Everybody has a different way of referring to the ends of cigarettes, but for us in the US, we call them butts, and that's not ingenious, but it's butts. But it allows us to think about some interesting pictures. But cigarette butts are the single most picked up item in the world on cleanups. That's not by weight, it's by number, but it's in the millions and millions and millions. Now you might, I just want to remind you that there were 6 trillion cigarettes smoked in a year, and over the last 20 years there's trillions and trillions and trillions. So that's how many they picked up, was 52 million over the last 20 years. So the point here is, yeah, it's bad, and it's interesting to pick them up, but picking them up doesn't work. It's never going to have an impact. And so recycling programs and sort of cleanup programs are not the answer. What has to happen is something farther upstream. This is what we think about in public health is the upstream preventive effort. So I want to emphasize that in a minute. But I think this is very indicative, though, of what the burden is. And so then we have to think, well, does this cause problems with people, or is it just little pieces of trash? Well, they go into, oftentimes, our water systems. That is, they're dumped on the street, they go into the sewer, they go into the sewers lead to the rivers, they lead then to the coasts. And many of the cigarette butts that are picked up on the beaches are from being washed back to the beach from the rivers. And then they may expose wildlife, but also human beings to this. We've seen that they leach out things like heavy metals, and that we know that birds and turtles and other animals have consumed these things. There's reports of these things that are in the literature. And we know that they've been tested. The water that a cigarette butt is soaked in, and it's called leachates, and are toxic to small microorganisms and water fleas, which are at the bottom end of the food chain. And we also know that these are a nuisance. Here in Rio, you have a fine against dropping your cigarette butt down, and I know it's been actually used. I saw newspaper articles about this where people were given a fine, but it's very rare. Most of the time, it's just dropped onto the street and it goes into the sewer. I've also seen on the beach, they drag tractors with a device on the back that filters the sand. They're picking up cigarette butts, like a filter on the sand. So every night, I don't know if it's every night, but many nights they filter the sand to get rid of the cigarette butts. Otherwise, the beach would be an ashtray. People are putting their cigarette butts down there all the time. So there's cost to this. That costs money to have real, Comlerb or whoever clean up the beach. We published a whole journal article, or a whole special issue of a journal on cigarette butts. It was in 2011, and we talked about all the evidence about consumption of cigarette butts and the economic costs, and we did a GIS tool to model how you can estimate the impact of cigarette butts. And we talked about the filters, cigarette filters, which I'll address in a minute here. And we also talked about some policy approaches, and the one that I want to just leave you with is called extended producer responsibility. And I'll tell you about that. That's what we want to try to get in place. We did some interesting research involving killing fish. And we used a standard Environmental Protection Agency assessment of toxicity of cigarette butts to aquatic organisms. And we used a small saltwater fish and a small freshwater fish, minnow, fathead minnow, and a topsmelt. And we did like a dilutional exposure study, which is actually very, it's very carefully controlled in terms of oxygen and food and all sorts of other exposures, such that you can then determine what the lethal dose 50 is for cigarette butts in water. So this is what we did, and we found that 1 cigarette butt in a liter of water kills half the fish. So the lethal dose 50 for a cigarette butt in water is 1 cigarette butt in a liter of water will kill half the fish, which classifies it, according to this protocol, as a toxic hazardous waste product. Not just a piece of litter, but a toxic hazardous waste product, which then means that it should be regulated as hazardous waste. That's the point, is that no longer is it just litter, but something that that somebody has to be held responsible for. And in the US, we have what are called stormwater regulations. This gets out of the realm of epidemiology and public health and into environmental science. So we require our cities to regulate what's dumped in their stormwater so that the stormwater doesn't contaminate the aquatic environments or the ocean or the rivers or anything. So cities are required to filter out hazardous waste. So they have to detect this hazardous waste. And we can do that with cigarette butts because they're big enough that they get caught in the storm drain filters. But there's also a lot of other stuff like antibiotics, pesticides, and cosmetics, this microbeads that are used to scrub your face are found in water systems. So if these things are found, cigarette butts and the chemicals from cigarette butts are also found. So we think it's hazardous waste, and it contaminates stormwater and beaches and aquatic environments. And so the question then comes up is, can it do something else? What we know is that kids and animals, whether they're pets or wild animals, are indiscriminate eaters. That means they'll pick up anything and stick it in their mouth. And there have been reports of kids eating cigarettes. I did a review of all the poison reports, all the poison centers in the U.S. for both, there's animal poison centers, by the way, animal poison centers and human poison centers, and there's thousands, tens of thousands of reports of animal and human consumption of cigarette butts from ashtrays or from the beach or what. You don't think about this, but there was a report in the CDC's MMWR about a bunch of kids who their parents weren't watching them. They ate cigarette butts out of an ashtray at a fashion mall, and had to go to their hospital and had to be hospitalized, a couple of them, for nicotine toxicity. So it happens, and animals too. They have been reported to consume these, so it's possible. Now, there may be health effects of consuming butts. This isn't a huge problem, but what we wonder about is when these butts get into the water systems, do the chemicals then continue to build up in the food chain? So one of my colleagues right now is doing some special chemical testing to see whether or not the chemicals that are leached out of cigarette butts can bioaccumulate in the food chain. We know that they kill the fleas, we know they kill microorganisms, we know that they kill fish, and do they then get into the food chain and move up? Now, I know this may sound weird, but there's a lot of cigarette butts out there, and it might be worth doing. So on my campus, every year, I've organized a butt cleanup. We have 1 square mile of campus, and it's smoke-free, right? The rule is nobody smokes on campus. So that happened 2 years ago, but for the last 5 years, I send out 50 students for 1 hour to pick up cigarette butts on the campus. And how many do you think I found on our smoke-free campus? In 1 hour with 50 students. Take a guess. Anybody? 10, 100, 1,000? 20,000 in 1 hour. 50 students, that's 400 and something per student per hour. 1 every 10 seconds. Smoke-free campus. So smoke-free policies are one way of trying to reduce cigarette butts, but that doesn't work that well either. So anyway, we collected all of these butts. What do you do with them when you collect 20,000 butts for 5 years? I have 100,000 butts sitting out in front of my office. Well, the state health department hired an artist and they built a piece of sculpture out of cigarette butts. And it was displayed as a demonstration of the environmental impact of cigarette butts. So they made this tree stump out of it, and they used all 100,000 of my cigarette butts and some others that they found as well. And you know, it was a good social media kind of thing. It was really very interesting to see the reaction of people to this. So what I want to close with is just this idea of extended producer responsibility. So this industry, which makes a lot of money off of tobacco sales, and has no responsibility for the environmental degradation, the waste that's produced, and the butt cleanup even. You know, many industries that produce a product, such as electronics and paint, we have rules now that say they have to take care of the product at the end of its life. In California, we have something called a Paint Care Act, which means that if you have unused paint from painting your house, you take it back, and the manufacturers have to deal with it. And that the manufacturer pays for it, not the taxpayer, not the community, well, the consumer has to pay for it because they'll pass the expense on. So what we think is that this can be done with tobacco as well. That the costs, the environmental damages, should be passed on to the tobacco industry, who will then pass it on to the smoker. You know, if they have higher costs to manufacture the product and sell it, that's going to go back to the consumer. When that goes back to consumer, what does that do to tobacco consumption? So this is why this is a tobacco control effort, because whatever regulatory authority is enacted to improve the environmental impact of tobacco will cost money, and that should not be that should not be the communities or the taxpayers, but really the tobacco industry, who will then pass it on to the consumer. So this whole cycle of responsibility means everything from the product design, where you can change the product so that it doesn't insult the environment so much, right? Or it could be, you know, just the whole cleanup and take back of things like they do with paint, or refrigerators, or motor oil, or tires, or electronics. Batteries, yeah. So that's where we're looking at the whole process of the responsibility going to the consumer. And this internalizes, you know, there's an economic term that when you have an externality, it means that somebody who's not the consumer is actually paying for the impact of the issue. For instance, with secondhand smoke, that's an externality of smoking, meaning that non-smokers are exposed. That was a very powerful intervention against tobacco because non-smokers were getting the harms from it and they weren't smokers. So the harm was externalized to smokers, or to non-smokers. And in this case, the environmental costs are externalized to taxpayers, communities, and non-smokers who did not choose to smoke cigarettes, and yet they are the ones who become responsible for it. So what has to happen is that it gets internalized to the tobacco industry and to the people who use the product as well. So it shifts the economic burden away from the government and taxpayers, and that becomes a public health impact. And it provides incentives or disincentives for producers to produce products that are not hazardous. So they can be regulated in their production process, and they can be regulated in what they produce. So there's been a lot of evidence for deposit return. That is, you know, there's guys out there collecting plastic bottles and cans and things. That works, you know, when you have an incentive to bring these things back. If you just go do pickups for fun or for public service, that doesn't work so well. But if you put a bounty on a hazardous waste product, people will pick it up and bring it back and get the money. But that money has to come from the industry, not from the taxpayers. And so electronics have advanced recycling fees. We have this Paint Care Act that I mentioned. We have a drug take-back program. One community in California has now forced the pharmaceutical industry to take back unused pharmaceuticals, unused drugs. Because what do you do with those? Dump them in the toilet? You shouldn't. And so somebody has to take care of that. And again, that should be the pharmaceutical company. So they passed a law at the local level in Alameda County, our favorite county, that would force the pharmaceutical industry to take back the drugs, unused drugs. So that could be the same kind of thing. And anyway, we've developed a model law actually to do this. At the local level, at the state level, a law that sets out the requirements to establish a take-back program for cigarette butts, which would be totally funded by the tobacco industry. And that would make it, no economic impact to the government. I want to mention filters, because the filter on a cigarette, everybody know what it's made out of? What's a filter made out of, cigarette filters? Anybody know? Cellulose acetate, which is a plastic, non-biodegradable waste product. So the cigarette butt, the gimba, is a little bit of tobacco, a little bit of paper, and a plastic filter that does not biodegrade. The interesting thing about the filter is it has no health benefit. So those of you who smoke and think you're getting some benefit from your filters, you're not. It actually has increased the risk of adenocarcinoma of the lung, which is a more aggressive type of lung cancer, after the filter was introduced 50 or 60 years ago. It's a marketing tool. It makes it easier to inhale their first cigarette for kids, and it convinces smokers somehow that they're protecting themselves by smoking a filtered cigarette, which on a machine has lower tar and nicotine yields, but a human is not a machine. The way it's smoked is what really determines the exposure. And filters, when you have a filter on a cigarette and you try to inhale against it, what happens? You have to take a bigger, deeper breath. It's like having a respirator forcing you to have this smoke go deeper into your lungs, which is again why the adenocarcinoma has become more frequent and it surpassed that of the small cell carcinoma. Anyway, it's a health risk, I think. And it's an environmental pollutant because it's non-biodegradable plastic. So if that's the case, filters should be prohibited. They should be taken off cigarettes and just have a plain cigarette with no filter on it. And even the biodegradable, some of the people have tried biodegradable filters, you still have the chemicals leaching out into the environment, so the biodegradable doesn't matter. Anyway, it's an environmental issue, but that's the point. The cellulose acetate filter lasts about 10 years, doesn't biodegrade. It'll photodegrade under ideal conditions, but not biodegrade. In California, one environmental legislator submitted a bill to the legislature to ban the sale of filtered cigarettes in California. We have 35 million people. That would have a major effect. It was shut down by the tobacco industry because they knew, they basically paid off the legislators to not hear the bill. Didn't get out of the committee. It's going to come back though. We'll see. Anyway, filters have been for a long time fraudulent. They've been implying that there's some lights. Find the solution. Camel lights, ultra lights. Kent cigarettes a long time ago had a filter that was made out of asbestos, which, asbestos is causes all sorts of problems, cancers, etc. Yeah. Anyway, and now e-cigarettes. I don't know. That's another issue that I want to talk about. So anyway, I mentioned this relative risks of cancer have increased over time. This is a little more epidemiology than you probably want to know, but the relative risk of lung cancer that we measured with multiple longitudinal surveys over history, the relative risk has actually increased. If filters had done any good to the cigarette market, the risk of cancer would have gone down. It hasn't. It's gone up. So that doesn't mean that we have, that we haven't reduced cancer incidence because people have quit smoking, but the risk of cancer has gone up. So the epidemiology is clear. Anyway, so here we have this project that my little NGO is doing with the World Health Organization's Tobacco-Free Initiative so that they can support this Framework Convention article about the environment. And it's going to consider this whole life cycle approach to the environment. And we're going to try to produce 4 really strong white papers that will be considered by the members of the Conference of the Parties, those who have signed on to the treaty. We're going to have a conference, we hope, in Bellagio, being an application for this. It's a very nice place to have a conference. And then what we hope is that there will be legislation that is binding obligations by the members of this Framework Convention to institute this extended producer responsibility. And we've got model legislation that can be used on this. So that's the idea, is that at some point at the national, local, state, provincial level, there's legislation that will force the tobacco industry to not just with cigarette butts, but with other kinds of environmental insults to take more responsibility. So the conclusion is that there's been a lot of environmental impacts, and that we've started to measure these, and we also have started to economically value them, and that the costs of government and the mitigation of tobacco environmental harms can be internalized to the tobacco industry, which would require then upstream approaches, not just downstream approaches of cleaning up the chemicals or the butts or the whatever, but actually upstream approaches to prevent the exposures that happen. So here's something that means a lot to Americans and maybe the British who think about cigarette butts on the beach. And these are a group of British surfers who made a statement about why cigarette butts should be kept off the beach, and they're very different beaches in the United Kingdom. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to talk to you.
Make questions in English if you want, or you can make it in Portuguese. I can translate. Just ask.
Sometimes I understand.
Yeah, but it's just the
Thank you so
microphone.
much. Is it possible to calculate all the budgets we spend in all the world with health, with the environment, and all of that?
You mean on the tobacco-related environmental costs? I think it is, actually. I think estimates can be made. Economists estimate everything. You know, they find some little data and then they can estimate everything with modeling and stuff like that. So, you know, we've done this with the healthcare costs. I mean, this has been econometric modeling that has allowed us to figure out what the smoking attributable healthcare costs. I was involved in that years ago too. But you know, this becomes quite robust and quite carefully evaluated. We've got economists working on these issues. In one city, in San Francisco, an economist, actually from Berkeley, also developed a model on how to estimate the cost of cigarette butt cleanup, the gimba cleanup at least. So this one piece of evidence was developed. And for San Francisco, which has a very low prevalence of smoking, they estimated that it cost about 22 cents per pack of cigarettes to clean up the environment from cigarette butts. So in San Francisco, they added that price to the cost of cigarettes sold in the city. 20 cents actually is what they added. And that then increased the tax on cigarettes that reduces consumption, and what happened then is that the tobacco companies sued San Francisco to say, oh, you can't do this, it's a warranted tax. But the city was able to document on the basis of the econometric study that this was actually a legitimate cost recovery that the city was entitled to. So they added a 20 cents per pack litter fee, and it held up against lawsuits, and so now that was in place. So we think that that's a model that can be used. So at the local level, you can do some estimations. At the, for greenhouse gases and this larger sort of environmental costs, I think that's going to take a lot more thinking and work. But yes, I do believe that it is possible to evaluate the costs and pass those back to the tobacco industry. Whether it's a fee on each pack of cigarettes that's sold or fines against them to recover. The other thing that's happened is that states in the U.S. and other places too have sued the tobacco industry because of the liability for the costs of cigarette smoking, and that created a huge circus of legal actions and payoffs. When the states sued the tobacco industry in the United States in 1998, it was a $287 billion settlement that they had to pay to the states because of the economic cost of health care. So in this case, what we hope is we're working on a litigation strategies also to look at environmental laws that they've been violated and the costs of cleanup, the costs of prevention, and bring that into a lawsuit against the tobacco industry. So yes, it's
thank you
part
for
of
the
our plan.
speech. Actually, I worked in a study about the health burden of tobacco here in Brazil, and with a researcher from Fiocruz, and she's updating the study now.
Economic study?
Yeah. But actually, we never think about this. We never take account of the environmental costs, right? Actually, but maybe this could be done, actually integrate health costs with the environmental ones, because here it's a really big problem, not only of the butts, but also for the farmer.
Yeah.
We are the second biggest producer, and I was thinking while you were speaking, because here in Brazil we have also the problem the illicit trade.
Yeah.
I work at NGO. I used to work there. I don't know if you know her, Paula Jones.
Oh, I know. Yeah, Paul.
I worked with her. So, and now the biggest issue here in the country is about the making Brazil ratify the protocol of illicit trade. So I was thinking how we could take this into it, because I know from I'm an economist, and I know how hard it is to make tobacco industry accept to have more taxes on their products. So
You have to have the evidence. You have to have the evidence.
Yes,
on
we
the
do.
economic burden, right?
I know the power of the lobbyists of tobacco, but I think it could be done, but it's gonna be hard to find a way to do it.
Well,
It's
this is why Article 18, when we can actually expand the discussion about Article 18 to actually make it a part of the treaty, so that the national legislation has to follow that. And this is what the intent is of this project that I mentioned with WHO. But you're right. I think it can be evaluated. The economics can be evaluated of the environmental costs. Here, for the tobacco growing, especially, some has been done on that. I know.
Yeah, there is a project of exchange of they are trying to make the producers change the kind of crop, conversion. But I forgot what.
Well, I don't think this would not relate to illicit trade. I don't think that there would be much of a relationship with illicit trade. I think it has to be done with this Article 18, the environmental article.
Yeah, the biggest discussion is about the global
warming.
No, global warming. The burden, the burden to the farmers.
Yeah.
But this part of environmental issue, it's not being talked that much.
Some time ago, I heard something interesting that we are all very ignorant in different issues, and I've been working with adult health and chronic disease, and I'm amazed to what extent I was ignoring till today. Thank you. Major issues. So I'm very interested in food chain issues. Lee Riley and I published an article about the extent to which chronic exposure to low dose of antibiotics used in farming plants and animals nowadays are introduced into the food chain and may, through changes in microbiota, influences the way we take energy from food. So, and you mentioned that filters have plastic. Am I right?
Yeah, they are made of plastic. Yes, cellulose acetate.
So, is there any hint that these plastics may be endocrine disruptors as other plastics? Have you?
I don't think that's been looked at. But when the filter breaks up, it's still a bunch of little plastic particles, right? Just like the microbeads from cosmetics. I mean, even if the filter, it doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't dissolve. It's going to be a bunch of little plastic particles. So your idea about understanding that is very, it's another effort. Yeah,
But it's not EPA.
no, it's not EPA.
But many endocrine disruptors or persistent organic pollutants is a very wide range of substances. that may contribute to many things, including obesity, the obesity epidemics.
Yeah, I mean, tobacco is always surprising as to what it can do to you. That makes it so bad. But these little plastic particles, they're all going to be containing these chemicals too that have been smoked through the cigarette. So it's not just the plastic, but it's also the toxic chemicals, which are, you know, full of all sorts of interesting poisons. And so what the chemist in our labs at San Diego is doing right now is they're testing this bioaccumulation, bioamplification in some fish, freshwater trout, and also mussels. And she's come up with a list of 200 chemicals that are identifiable in the water that the cigarette butts go floating in. And now they're at the stage of looking to see whether or not this can bioamplify in the living organism. So I don't know that it's the plastic so much as it's going to be the chemicals. That's what she's really focused on. But that's, you know, I hadn't thought about that actually. It's an interesting thought.
Another hypothesis.
Yeah.
Oh, a program for smokers that want to quit and that use this kind of data. If this is better to counseling these people, it makes them easier to quit or not.
You know, there's a lot of, we did a lot of social media on this. We had paid small videos that went into the movie theaters about cigarette butts, showing butts going into the storm drains and being sniffed at by a dog and fish floating around. So we were really trying to exercise this environmental concern that kids have. Kids are very tuned into the environmental sort of issues. So we really were trying to make this relevant to children as a social media kind of intervention. The state health department actually paid for these videos. The Legacy Foundation, which is a national advocacy group, also paid for several videos related to these environmental issues. And most of it had to deal with the cigarette butts, but they also mentioned deforestation and other issues. So we think that there's an audience for this to denormalize tobacco use. I mean, that's the other part of it. You increase the cost when you can incorporate the cost of cleanup and prevention, but you are also making this socially denormalized. And that's another really, I think, key thing. It's like banning smoking in restaurants denormalizes smoking. Banning it in parks, beaches, and in outdoor environments denormalizes smoking. So that's another part of this. Any questions? Well, now when you go out on the street, you're going to look and see the cigarette butts everywhere. They're everywhere. They're easy to see.
It's not so much a question but a commentary about, we'll actually expand to what Aline was talking about, is the environmental damage done by tobacco farming.
Yeah.
Which is, it's environmental and also economic in the sense that it creates almost a sort of semi-slavery with regards to the farmers, because they have, as you said, it's a sort of indented servitude because they have to pay for the seeds. And the thing is, one of the things that the industry has been doing, remember that Tom mentioned the issue about the green tobacco and the contamination. One of the things that the industry has done over the years is to increase the amount of nicotine in the plant. But the farmers have to pay additionally for having this kind of seed, because it's the only kind of plant that the tobacco company is going to accept. So they owe the tobacco company the seeds, and usually whatever the money they make, they're always in debt to them. So that's one of the things in terms of crop conversion, is to help them to get out of this kind of cycle. And the other thing is, nicotine has a neurological effect, and many of the pesticides that they use have neurological effects as well, and they use it a lot. That's another environmental effect, especially here in Brazil. They use it totally out of control. And I recall something that you told me years ago, Gunnar, about neurological syndromes that were happening all over the Rio Grande do Sul. I don't know if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah. Nicotine is a neurotoxin as well as an immunomodulator,
Yes,
right?
and there's
Pesticides, yeah, of course.
we have shown in one study the problem of the tobacco verde, the green tobacco.
Yeah.
disease, very, very grave in the south. They work in very bad conditions, and everything is the best for the industry, but not for the people who work. So.
Well, even in the U.S., we have still lots of reports of breed tobacco illness in the South, because these farms are family farms, and the children are there working, in the fields too. And it's still, even in any modern farming situation, they still get it.
One of the things that we report is suicide.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it says a victim.
Oh, interesting.
And one thing that we were thinking about also, it's because although the prevalence is decreasing, and there's efforts for the crop inversion, we have suspect. I made this my monograph of my bachelor degree about the illicit trade, and there is I tried to estimate how was the chain of production of tobacco leaves, and there is some amount of the tobacco leaf that just disappears. We think that it fits the production of Paraguay, so it can decrease the prevalence here. The production is not decreasing as well. It's been a while, it was 5 years ago, but when I did this,
Yeah, it's like
the
the
same
industry
roots.
changes in response to regulation. Every time we put a regulation on something, they figure out some way to get around it.
Yeah, exactly. The same route that comes the cigarettes, comes the cigarette from Paraguay. Probably it's going back the leaves from here.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the U.S., we import a lot of tobacco now. Even though I think we're the fourth or fifth largest producer. Now it's China, and Brazil, and India. I think and the U.S. is fourth, I think. But we import foreign-grown tobacco into the U.S. And then the legislators from those states insist that our trade laws protect their products, these cigarettes that are about half, at least, foreign-grown tobacco as a U.S. product. So I mean, even when we say that they're just trying to protect American products that are made in the United States, what they're actually doing is importing half the tobacco that's grown that's put into an American cigarette, and then trying to say that this is an American product. Which it's another way around all of this regulatory activity in the trade business as well. So.
I assume that you're very familiar with the nuts and bolts of the framework convention, right, on tobacco. And at our Center for Global Health here in Rio, we started to discuss the possibility of joining the global campaign for a similar convention on food and nutrition. Would you comment on that, on the pros and cons, and if you have some advice on? Because there is an NGO called Consumers International, actually is having their annual or periodic meeting in Rio at this time. It's about to happen. They are the leaders of this proposal, and we are considering. Daniela is here. Just from the Institute of Nutrition, and would you comment on that?
Well, yeah, you know that the Framework Convention was started up by the WHO because it's in their bylaws that they have the ability to begin discussions of implement treaties. So that's part of the responsibility or the ability of the WHO to do this. So that's the first one that's been that they've done under their charter. So yes, it's possible that the WHO can take this on as another framework convention, but I have to tell you that, first of all, it's very expensive to do this, and their budget probably, right now the budget of the WHO is 20% regular budget and 80% provided by donors, so that they do not have control over 80% of the budget that's spent there. Donors who direct. It's expensive because of the gathering, the negotiating processes. Each time you bring everybody into Geneva to start this process, it's millions of dollars. And countries small countries, that don't have those resources to do this, and so it ends up having to be raised someplace else. So they are expensive activities. The other thing is that they become so incredibly political. You can imagine what happens. And many people I know in this global health business say that we shouldn't do these big treaty things because you can find ways to accomplish the same thing without having to go through the extraordinarily difficult process. On the other hand, what I like to see is when you bring this discussion and people into Geneva or wherever to raise the level of this discussion, it explodes the issues. It makes everybody else, the world much more aware of them. And so just the whole discussion process becomes valuable in and of itself, I think. But the treaty negotiation process, I think you have very few countries that would say, let's do that because it's so much fun. It's not. It was a very difficult thing to bring. The U.S. never signs any treaties anyway. We very, very seldom sign any treaties. So having the U.S. as part of it would be a very challenging thing. And yet, so much of the commerce related to food is something that the U.S. is involved in. So I think very difficult, very expensive, but also valuable just in terms of the discussions that come from it and the research that comes behind it as well. So, but, I'm not sure how many people would write the process.
Just to add one other point, tobacco is one product.
Yeah.
And for obesity, it's many, many products. And food is not also only damaged.
Yeah.
We need food. It's difficult in this point.
The tobacco is involved in food products as well.
I will raise another issue that for tobacco, it's difficult to blindar from the industry interference on the negotiations.
Yeah, to keep them at a
Yeah, for the industry, for the food industry, since there is not just damage, it would be harder.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but
Yeah, food has benefits, of course.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
but the tobacco, it has absolutely no benefit to human health, and it's mostly economic benefit to some countries. A few countries who depend on it. But food is more complicated because, and in the case of food, you can't possibly have food policies without involving the food industry. If you have to, regulate them, but you still have to get them to cooperate. In the case of the tobacco industry, what you want to do is pound them into submission. It's a different process. Thank you for your questions. They're really good.
Would you like to make any closing remarks? Or?
I think, I'm going to work with Tanya Cavalcanti and some others here in Brazil to get this environmental issue put into the Conference of the Parties. So, as an American, we have no ability to do that. So, I have to ask somebody else to do this. I know they do. I was. Yeah, I know there's been a lot of stuff done here already. So that's why it's natural for Brazil to take perhaps leadership on this.
In the name of the Center and everyone here, I'd like to thank you a lot again. And just making a couple of commentaries that I can just make. One of them is how the tobacco industry sometimes looks like a cartoon villain, something like that. And everything they do is very bad, and many think that everything they do, then comes up something even worse. And just to drive this point further, There's a number of people who wrote about how this whole strategy of creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt about science was developed by the tobacco industry and then was captured by other areas. And Stephen Glantz last year, who is a pioneer and has been working a lot with this internal documents, has published a paper showing that the Tea Party in the U.S. was financed and created along exactly the same lines that the tobacco industry created a network of so-called NGOs to defend the civil rights of smokers. So aside from everything else, there is also a link to a very bad branch of public policy as well, trying to influence the public discourse. So it's a very powerful, very cunning, and a very complicated enemy. But we have to, and on the other hand, I think there's a message of hope in that it has been taking over 40 years, but we're making genuine and progress in certain areas. So
There's still a lot of jobs for people in this.
once again, thank you. Thanks for everyone. That's it.